Hi, and welcome to Just War 101, part 3 of 4. In the first two parts, we talked about Just War Past and Just War Present. And in this video, we're going to be talking about my having been reborn on the 4th of July, which is another way of saying when I was a Christian soldier, what did this have to say to me, if anything? And how did my experience as a soldier and as a veteran influence and shape how I engage with this tradition of just war and scripture and theology, and how my experience and training, both military training and theological training, helped me understand and think through how just war might be meaningful and valuable, despite its potential misuse or abuse. So, in a very quick nutshell, I spent 6 years in the United States Army as an artilleryman. First, I was a paratrooper for 2 years at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was in the dentist chair when the towers fell on 9/11, and many of us tried to get to the units that were going to war, and I didn't succeed. So I decided instead to go green to gold, become an officer, go to school in Hawaii. And when I got to Hawaii, I had just missed my unit's deployment to be the invasion force in Kuwait by just a couple of days. And so I found myself in Hawaii. My battle buddies from boot camp and Fort Bragg deployed to invade Iraq. And then when I had the opportunity to either deploy or to continue on my ROTC application, I chose to let the ROTC application go, which meant that I deployed. And so when I deployed to Iraq, I spent a lot of time driving and going all over the place as a quick reaction force for the country. And while I was there, I read my Bible because I was bored. And the more I read, the more I was just fascinated by soldiers in Scripture, New Testament, Old Testament, and I wanted to know, like, what was my place in it? Where did I fit in? And of course, soldiers and Roman citizens stood out to me in the New Testament. And I noticed that they were often seen in a negative light, particularly in Mark and John. The going the second mile in Matthew 5, that was a military thing. In Rome at the time, a soldier could force someone's livestock to carry his gear for 1 mile, no more. And so when Jesus says, if somebody asks you to go a mile, that is a Roman soldier treating a person as an animal. And if you're treated as an animal, as less than human, be more than that. Be as humble as you can be and go the second mile. Show them not only that you're not an animal, but that you can exceed their expectations. The other thing that I struggled with, obviously, was the Passion of Christ and the crucifixion. The soldiers there, we might think of them as doing these horrendous things like killing Jesus by piercing him in the side. But in reality, there were local recruits in the Jerusalem cohort, and they would have, in my parlance, they would have just pulled the wrong detail. They would have been assigned to do this thing because crucifixion happened all the time, and they were just in an unfortunate position. When they're casting lots for Jesus' clothes, condemned criminals had their possessions confiscated. So it was just a matter of like who was going to get what. When they were harassing and abusing him, that's really hard to deal with, to interpret. But the text makes a point to show that that's already happened, that his own religious community has already done that. When Caiaphas draws or pulls him in front of, Caiaphas, the high priest, tries Jesus, the people there, observant, rigorously observant, probably Sadducees, slap him in the face and accuse him of blasphemy. And so it was difficult reading through the lens of my being a soldier. But if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have noticed some of these other incredible things, like the Eucharistic prayer, which is said right before the priest consumes the Eucharist in Catholic Mass, is coming from the centurion of great faith, not just from Matthew 8 and Luke 7, but also in John 4. It's the same parallel story. In Matthew and Luke, it's Hecatontarchus, a centurion, but in John, it's a Basileus, a nobleman. And it happens in Galilee, where Herod Antipas was in charge, and he was a client state of Rome, and so he was allowed to have his own military. The centurion of great faith is not Roman. He probably grew up in Galilee, not far from Jesus and his cousin John. And he's called a nobleman because that is what a commander is. There's the king, and he commands the whole army, and then there's his nobles and other aristocrats that command smaller forces. And so when the evangelists try and think of what to call this person, John calls him a basileus, a nobleman, and Matthew and Luke call him a centurion, which is a Roman term. And they're the same person because he asked for healing for his pays, his beloved son or his beloved servant. And so this centurion of great faith makes Jesus marvel. This disbelief that someone is even more faithful who is not of Israel, and who is also this outsider who a lot of people would have looked at with some suspicion. I also would have noticed Longinus. There shouldn't be an N there. There usually is. But the Greek word logch, the spear, there's no N in there. It's just logche or logch. I don't know how to actually pronounce it. But Saint Longinus is the name that we give to two different soldiers in the Bible. And the oral traditions combine them. And the one in John, it's the soldier who pierces Jesus' side and water and blood comes out. The story, the tradition is that the blood hits his eyes and it cures a visual ailment he had. The other story that is pulled into the St. Longinus tradition is in the Synoptic Gospels, where this soldier sees the earth shake and the dead come out of the ground, and he looks up at the cross at Jesus who has just died and said, surely this is a son of God, or this is a righteous man, depending on the gospel. And so this one person, Longinus, both is responsible, most directly responsible for the death of Jesus, but also confesses him Lord before any of the apostles ever do. And so the narrative complexity of these characters is just overwhelming. And finally, St. Cornelius, in Acts 10, the first Gentile eligible for circumcision who doesn't have to do it, who is baptized into this Jesus movement that was born in Judaism, but it was increasingly making itself distinct in loosening some of the strictures that were applied for new converts to Judaism. If you want to enter this weird subset, you could avoid some of those things and still be a full member, so long as you were baptized and you didn't eat food sacrificed to idols or sleep around. And so my experience made me come at these traditions, scripture, as well as theology, from a different angle. And so the moral questions I was asking when I began thinking about just war, pacifism, nonviolence, I realized just war had nothing to say to me. I was not the legitimate or illegitimate authority. It was not up to me how many other options we tried and whether war was the last result. It didn't speak to me. And as a lower enlisted service member, I represented the vast majority of people who would go participate in war. And so just war felt unsatisfying. There's also these new arenas where we talk about jus ad bello, before war, and jus post bello, justice after war. But I wasn't really clear who these distinctions served, what my part was in these decision makers. And in the Gospels, it's the least, the last, the lost who Jesus seems to care most about. But with just war, it was the people with power, the people making decisions, the people that had the least to lose when it came to war. And so coming at these questions from a different angle forced me to ask a different set of questions and seek a different set of answers. And one of the things I'll talk about in a moment, but the theologians that I cited in the first video, Augustine, Aquinas, Grotius, Ramsey, Walzer, all of them are civilians. Some of the heaviest hitters in the theology or the theory of violence, international violence, had never participated in that those set of acts or behaviors that we call war. And so certainly you can have an informed understanding of something without experiencing it, but why settle for that if you can also have reflections that are informed reflections that include direct experience of the thing that we're talking about. For example, I was present for both of my kids' birth. I could tell you what childbirth is like, but my wife would be a more reliable narrator of that because she has a more comprehensive set of experiences to draw her conclusions from. And a lot of people do talk about childbirth. A lot of men talk about childbirth, but I think the same kind of uneasiness we feel with relying on men to talk about women's experience, something that is exclusively the experience of women. I think that same suspicion and unease should be applied to these discussions of war and peace. And that's what I mean when I talk in this slide about it being an abstraction from lived experience. It has numerous weaknesses. It's a theory, dynamic and alive, but it's only a theory until we can actually put boots on the ground, so to speak. And so that is my experience of how I came to these questions differently. I don't think that the most important moment in time for the church in state and the most important kind of point in time where that relationship was evolving, I don't think was when Constantine legalized the religion. I think that a more salient entry point into this is the Priscillian affair of 385. Priscillian was a heretic who talked about all kinds of weird things, and what he talked about wasn't important. What is important is that two Spanish bishops sought to silence him through execution. It was never, doubted that he was a heretic, but how we deal with heretics before had been whatever, just ignore them, right? Outrage management. Let them believe what they're going to believe, and we just won't, I don't know, serve communion with them or something. I don't know. But instead, what these bishops wanted to do was they appealed to Rome to have him killed, so that instead of just dealing with an ecclesial matter ecclesially, they took the ecclesial matter to the state and expected the state to do something. And so they accused Priscillian of practicing magic, and the Roman emperor has zero interest in magic, just as Pilate had zero interest in blasphemy during the Passion. Pilate's give me a break. That's your problem, not me. That's a you problem, not a me problem. And so I think Priscillian helps us understand this, the distinction. There's something that's not quite making, not quite connecting, and that it gets boiled down when we want our solutions to include violence. Not that we've been persecuted or not persecuted, but what happens when we assume the throne and then we think that we get to do the same things that the state has done. So Martin of Tours was a popular bishop in the 4th century who spent many years in the military. When he was born, the law was that if your father had served, you would serve. And so he gets conscripted into the Roman military at 15 in 321, and I think in 336 I can't remember the dates offhand, but he enters the military. Doesn't want to. He wants to be a Christian, a monastic from an early age, but he kind of allows himself to be taken up, doesn't object, and he eventually is assigned to the Praetorian Guard, which is like the Secret Service in that it protects Caesar. Now, within a couple of years in his service, he finds himself in a very cold winter in Amiens in northern France. And he sees a freezing beggar, and he takes his Secret Service uniform, his Praetorian Guard cape, cuts it in half, and gives half of it to the freezing beggar. That night he has a dream of Jesus Christ saying before the heavenly host, "Here is Martin, my servant, who has clothed me." The next morning he goes off and gets baptized. Now that's not disputed. What is disputed is the timing of what happens next. His own biographer is a little embarrassed by Martin's military service, and so he kind of flubs the numbers. And he says shortly thereafter, what happens is he finds himself on the battlefield at the Battle of Worms or the Battle of Strasbourg. And he, as Caesar Julian is going down the line, giving gifts of money to his soldiers to secure, some last-minute loyalty, he comes to Martin, and Martin says, I've served you long enough. Let me now serve my God. I'm a soldier of Christ. It is impermissible for me to fight." So Julian flies under rage. He locks him up, and Martin hears that Julian is accusing him of cowardice. And so he says, "Well, if it's the cowardice that be put down, let me proceed to the front lines unarmed, protected only by the sign of the cross, not by shield and helmet." And so they're going to send him to the front lines unarmed when overnight there's a peace treaty, the battle is averted, and then Martin finds himself discharged dishonorably. He wasn't given any land and money, which was the custom, and so he was discharged dishonorably because he pissed off Julian. The problem is that didn't happen within a year or two of the baptism. It didn't happen until 356 when Julian was undergoing his Gallic campaign. And so it's much more likely, and the timeline is much more reliable if it is in fact the case that he spent 25 years in military service, a full 25-year term before he actually encountered the battlefield and refused to fight in war. He seemed to have no problem protecting Caesar's life, but he wouldn't fight in war. And so when the Priscillian affair occurs, when he's an old man, he's been made a bishop kind of against his will in this major metropolitan see and Tours. He very vocally opposes this assassination attempt. And because he's so tight with the emperors, he spent all his time in, and Christianity is legal. Julian kind of transitions out, and he actually catechizes, converts Emperor Maximian's wife, the Empress. And so he's got really close ties with political elites, even as this humble bishop who refused to sleep in his own cathedral. He slept in a cave across the Loire River. And so he appeals to Maximian and says, don't kill him. That's not your place. They shouldn't be asking you to do this. And there's some political maneuvering. The Spanish bishops succeed in having him executed while Martin was away from the emperor. And then Martin, in response, very publicly excommunicates these Spanish bishops who had succeeded in executing a heretic for the first time in church history. And so Martin, reflecting on a life of military service, is able to distinguish the kind of maybe hair-splitting details that others like Augustine don't seem as capable of doing. He has seen persecution, he has been subject to it, and he doesn't want it on anybody else. He recognizes a problem when he sees it, and Augustine is a little bit more like, not sheepish, but he's much more obtuse, I suppose. He doesn't want to, he doesn't want Rome to fall. He doesn't want his lifestyle to change. And Martin has kind of already undergone a catastrophic event that forces his convictions to solidify. In the language of modern army regulations, you had a crystallization of conscience. And so these catastrophic moments can actually help shape our understanding. Paul Tillich was a great theologian, and he was a Nazi soldier, and he repented of that. And so Tillich's, what does he call it? The Wounded God, or something, I can't remember. Tillich, Jürgen Moltmann, all of these theologians who have seen war, they don't often talk about just war, but I really wish we would listen to those who have been to war if we're going to talk about war. And here's Augustine. I've already kind of covered him. But that's how my experience, which I tell in my 2012 book, Reborn on the 4th of July, that's how my experience has affected how I come about this. In the last part, I'll talk about some of these other soldier saints that we could turn to that would help us kind of navigate those, hair-splitting details that I mentioned earlier. The difference between blind loyalty and moderated acceptance or tolerance of something. I think that more moderating voice that you get from people who've experienced war, who have no interest in justifying it, but who do have an interest in understanding its meaning and significance for the moral life. I think if we listen to those voices, if we privilege those voices, we'll come out with a more complex and nuanced understanding of the nature of violence and its potential necessity.